This story has been recorded at an Addictive Eaters Anonymous meeting in New Zealand. You can email us at contact@aeanz.org.
I'm Jill and I'm an addictive eater. I thought that's the easy bit. But yeah, it's nice to be here, and I always feel a bit anxious about sharing. But I was reading a story in the big book today, and this person said, I became alcoholic because I drank. And I thought, that is not my experience. I believe I was born an addictive eater, and I was just waiting to pick up the first one. I don't think for a moment that the food made me an addictive eater. I was the addictive eater anyway. And, I have memories of stealing food and hiding food and having my private little stash of food from when I was 2 or 3 years old. And I guess that was the substance that was available to me. If I'd lived in a house full of alcohol, who knows? But I'm quite sure that I spent a lot of years trying to figure out what made me eat. And I thought it was because of the terrible childhood I had, and because of the terrible town I lived in the terrible country I'd been brought up, and my awful siblings and my worst parents. And then I read about how people who had been sexually abused particularly often became addictive eaters, and I thought I must have been sexually abused, but I had no memory of that. So then I read about repressed memory, and that explained everything. And, the relief for me when I came here and, heard the message that I still hear today in meetings, that I am an addictive eater because I was born that way, and I have absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. I always felt different. I always felt as though I didn't belong. I was the kid who was never going to get picked for the team. At school they used to divide the class up and you get picked for teams, and I was always the last one. I just didn't know how to be part of anything. And all the way through my childhood growing up, I had that feeling of being ill at ease, of not belonging, of not knowing how to fit in. It was like there was some secret to getting on with the rest of the human race, and I just didn't know what it was. And it was awful going through life feeling like that feeling of not belonging. And when I was 17, I discovered alcohol, and that took away all my problems really fast. And the other advantage of it was that I know a lot of other people, when they started to drink, they'd put on weight. I lost weight, and that was wonderful, because all I really wanted in life was to be thin. And I wasn't grossly overweight. When I look at school photos, I was a bit overweight at times, but in my mind, I was enormous, and I always thought I'd be happy if I got thin. And like I said, I discovered alcohol and I lost a lot of weight. And for many years of my drinking and my eating, I thought for many, many years that I had control of my eating, because when I was drinking, I didn't want to eat. And, the self-delusion of the addict is amazing. I just thought, because my weight went up and down in accordance with what other substances I was using, I always had that idea that I was controlling the weight, and it was absolute rubbish. I was just swapping from one addiction to the other. And that was another thing I learned when I came into the program, that addiction swaps from one substance to the other. And, you know, it was amazing for me coming into the program and looking back on my life and the things I heard just totally rang true with my experience. I mean, I had blundered through my life, never been able to figure out why things were going wrong with me, never been able to figure out why I couldn't make decisions, why I didn't have a proper career, why my relationships were always so lousy, why everything went wrong. And when I came to a 12-step fellowship, my whole life started to fall into place. You know, it just, I don't mean it as in everything got better, I mean it explained why my life had been the way it was. You know, I heard, well, big thing I discovered was that addiction isn't particularly about the substance. You know, it's a substance that brought me in, and I'm very grateful for that. But, you know, I discovered that addiction was about so much more than my eating. You know, it was about my whole personality, the way I lived, my belief systems, just everything. And coming here just made sense of the way I had been all my life. You know, and I've often shared at meetings that when I came here, there was nothing in this program that I thought was a good idea. You know, I was horrified to see God on the wall, absolutely horrified. Well, not so much horrified, I was disappointed because I thought, if it's about God, I can't go there. I'd have to try and find somewhere else. And thank God that didn't happen. But, you know, the whole idea of listening to somebody else's suggestions or instructions, the whole idea of taking my inventory when the world had been so nasty to me, the whole idea of making amends, and worst of all, the idea of doing something for someone else was just all, I don't know, I was going to say intolerable, but it was more that I just thought, why would you do that? Why would you do any of those things? And, you know, sometimes I feel as though I haven't changed much. And when I think of my attitude to the steps in this program and the way I thought they were all just absurd, and I don't, you know, my thinking today is absolutely opposite, like it's just the best way to live. You know, and that makes me realise how much things have changed. But it happened through, you know, it happened through a lot of grief. You know, like I fought against this program. I didn't want people telling me what to do, you know, and more than anything else, I did not want to give up the food. I mean, I was in AA before I came here, and you know, I remember I used to think when I was in AA, I was so angry about the fact that I couldn't control my food, you know, and I used to yell at God and say, you know, what do you want from me? You know, how dare you want me to give up everything else? Isn't the fact that I've given up alcohol enough for you? You know, just demented. And I think fortunately I lived on my own, so I could probably afford to yell and shout at God more than people who lived with a family might want to. But, you know, I used to yell the stuff at God, you know, and it was, haven't you taken enough from me? You know, that was my attitude. And I tried managing the food addiction through AA because I thought it's the same program. It's exactly the same step, exactly the same program. It's all addiction. You know, I must be able to do it through here because I did not want to come here. You know, I mean, I find even today, you know, I can whip up a bit of glamour about drinking, but there's, you know, I was a very secret eater. I wasn't somebody who publicly loved food. I was terribly ashamed of it. And I did, you know, I did all my eating in secret. And I did not want to, well, I didn't want to stop eating for one thing, but I didn't want to, you know, tell anyone about what was happening. You know, so I led this absolute, you know, when I think about it, I mean, I think what a hard way of life it is, you know, to have that desire all the time and to be eating and hiding it. And I spent quite a few years coming in and out of a food fellowship. And I found the meetings here where some of you people here tonight were there already. And I heard, you know, I knew that it wasn't working through AA, and whether it should or not, it wasn't, and that I needed to come here. And I came to a meeting and, you know, heard people talk about recovery from food addiction in a way that I had never heard before. And it was partly that, you know, the people in that room were a normal size. I don't think I thought they were thin. I think I thought they were just a normal size, and that was very reassuring to me, that they were a normal size. But it was far more than that. They were, they had a peace about them, you know, that, and I could see that they had some peace in their lives. I mean, for all I know, they may have gone home and picked the cat and all their family, I don't know. But it sort of seemed to me that they just had a peace about themselves. And, you know, I had no peace in my life. You know, I was such a bad-tempered person. I had always been a really bad-tempered person. And as the food got worse in my life, I think I got a whole lot more bad-tempered. You know, people were always in my way. I was very suspicious of people. I was very angry. I mean, I remember I used to wake up every morning and pray to be kind and loving and gentle with everyone. And I'd get out the door in the car and start tooting the horn at people who are in the way. And I'd get to work and, you know, I'd start yelling at people. I mean, they must have thought I was really insane. You know, when I went to make amends to those people, you know, none of them said, no, you weren't like that. They knew exactly what I was talking about. I was just crazy. And, you know, I look back and I think it must have been awful for them. You know, living with this person who just yelled at them. Yeah, it's just, you know, it's still sometimes today when I think about it, I think just how awful that must have been to people. But, you know, I had dreaded making amends to people, and I discovered through making amends to people of just how kind people can be and how tolerant they are. But, you know, it makes me very, very grateful not to be like that today. Yeah, and anyway, I came here and I got sidetracked, as happens. But, you know, to see people here who weren't like I was amazing. I can still remember that first meeting and leaving that meeting with that little bit of hope, you know, because I saw those people, you know, in whom the problem had been solved. You know, they talked about the way they used to be, and they were just calm And I loved that, I loved that calmness about them, and that they weren't like I was. It was wonderful. And I totally embraced the program, and I got a sponsor and got a food plan and thought all my Christmases had come at once. And then somewhere along the line, I decided that my case was different. I think it's a very much a trait of addicts to think that their case is different, and I thought mine was different. And I decided that, I could make some exceptions in my food plan when it suited me. I found it very humiliating to ring the sponsor and, say I'd forgotten my zucchini or something like that. So, to solve this problem, because I hated admitting that I'd done anything wrong, I just decided I wasn't going to talk about those things anymore. And there were a lot of little incidents like that. I remember I used to go and visit my parents, and they couldn't cope with me cooking my mother couldn't cope with me cooking my own food. So I just decided when I visited them to just have what they had, because it was pretty similar to my food plan. And, those little lies, those little deceits, they just chip away, and they got bigger and bigger. And the more I did that, the more I thought, I can't possibly tell anyone what I'm doing, because it just became a much bigger accumulation of lies about what I was doing. And, I had a service position that I think quite a lot of people looked up to me, and I was living this life of deceit, to me, it just got blacker and blacker and blacker. And I realised that, being a bit of a drama queen, I would have to go to my deathbed, and I might make a deathbed confession of what I've been doing. But, it certainly wasn't going to happen before then. In fact, I thought it'd be really good to make a deathbed confession. And that's how I thought. And, I live with that. And, the enormity of living with lying like that and hiding what I was doing was just, it was just crazy. I remember after I finally got to a point where I couldn't do it anymore, and and I had to go and talk to my sponsor about what I've been doing. And several people said to me, "You look 10 years younger, what's happened?" And that was, carrying that burden. And I often think of that bit in the big book where it says half measures availed as nothing, and I never, in all those years, had a moment's peace of mind. I mean, I think there were times in those years when I was probably eating on the food plan quite, may have been weeks or months, I don't know, but I think there were times. But, in the back of my mind, I always reserved the right to go and eat when it suited me. And, because of that, I in my mind, I was eating that whole time, and I never had any peace of mind. In all those years, I never had any peace of mind. And, what happened was that I just got to the stage where I couldn't do it anymore. It was exactly like it had been from a drinking, except it took me a lot more years to get to that point where I just could not do it anymore. I was just, just completely exhausted by it, and I couldn't do it. And, I had to admit defeat. I had nothing left in me that I could carry this on anymore. And, the book says, who cares to admit defeat? And I tried for years not to admit defeat. And today, you know, I just feel so very, very grateful that I got to that point where I couldn't do it anymore. And I went and told my sponsor absolutely everything I could think of that I had done. You know, and I also feel very grateful that you can't get kicked out of this program, because, you know, I felt that I didn't deserve to be here. And it took me probably 3 years for that feeling of not deserving to be here to wear off, you know. And I'm very aware today, you know, I'm not here on merit. You know, I just feel very grateful that I have been given a second chance. And I feel very grateful that I stayed, because if I had left during that time, I'm not sure that I would ever have come back. You know, I would have found it so humiliating, so embarrassing, so crushing, so whatever, that I'm not sure I ever would have come back. But, you know, I was here, and, you know, eventually I was able to talk about what I did. I had to make a lot of amends all over again. And, you know, that was really good for me, because I had to go back to some people and say, hey, you know, that amends I made to you 10 or 15 years ago, I skipped out some bits, and I had to go back to those same people and make the rest of my amends. And, you know, again, I was, you know, I am endlessly amazed at how generous other people are, because, you know, I didn't deserve. I'll just say that people were really, really generous when I made amends. And, you know, I had to go back to being a newcomer, and I hated that. You know, my sponsor treated me as if I was in day one again. You know, whereas if I'd had my way, I think I would have just been someone who done a few things on the side. Yeah, that desire to eat was taken away from me, you know. I never like to say anything like I gave up the food, because it wasn't me doing anything. I didn't give up anything. That desire was taken away by a power greater than me, and I totally believe that today. You know, and I haven't had to eat since that time, you know, just. And if the desire to eat hadn't been taken away, I don't know whether I would have stopped eating. You know, I mean, that's pointless speculation, but you know, it does leave me absolutely knowing that God has done for me what I could not do for myself. And God has done so much, you know, all that anger and bad-temperedness. I mean, I occasionally get like that. I have an issue with some neighbours over magnolias that irk me from time to time. And there's, you know, sometimes I get bad-tempered about things, but, you know I'm not going to break out into, you know, into a wall of outrage. You know, I love today, one of the big things that's changed for me, and I know for a lot of other people here too, is getting more involved in meditation. And, you know, I love that. I love the practicality of meditation, of just being able to stop, you know, when I do have those negative emotions, which don't actually happen all that often, but when they do, just being able to stop and take stock and breathe quietly. And, you know, there's always something else I can do, you know, and that something else is, you know, the best something else I can do most of the time is to do something for someone else. And that is something I hated doing. I just couldn't see any point in why would you do something for other people when nobody's done anything for me. you know, and that's just crazy thinking. And, you know I have a peace of mind in my life today. You know, I don't have that turmoil. I don't wake up angry in the morning. You know, if there's a problem in life, I can talk to the sponsor, I can talk to God, I can talk to other people in the fellowship. And, you know, there is always a solution to everything. And one of the things I really love today is living my life knowing, this is not really about living one day at a time, but knowing that whatever happens in the future, it will all work out all right. Everything will be fine. God's running the show and I don't need to worry. And, you know, I remember somebody years ago who always used to say to me, Jill, what if the sky should fall? Because, you know, that's what I was like. I was always worried that the sky would fall. And, you know, to live knowing that, you know, if the sky does fall, there'll be a solution. I don't know what it will be. But just to know that everything's all right and that there will never, I mean, just to have that, I have got that certainty that whatever happens in my life, there will be a solution for it and there will be someone who can help me. And I thought, how many people out there in the world live knowing? I mean, I don't know whether other people live with all that uncertainty and doubt and fear. But, you know, it's wonderful not to live with that fear today. And I know it's all, you know, it's all because of you people and this program and, you know, having these steps as a way of living and having a sponsor and, you know, having God running the world. It just gives me a peace of mind that I never had before. So anyway, I'm very grateful to be here and thank you for asking me to share.